Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. As usual, people sort of floated and I'll let them in as they come in. So I am armed with my tea, notes, and highlighters ready for this discussion. We do have some new people with us. So what I'll do is just, well, as people join, there might be more than expected, but I'm going to very quickly try and go through everybody. And if you could just tell us who you are, and also, have you read the document, yes or no, in your introduction? So I am Liam Henderson. I am chair of the Rail Innovation Group, and I have been chair of the Rail Innovation Group since 2016. And I also do passenger experience and tech sort of work in rail the rest of the time. And I'm based in London, and I have read the document. Johanna.
Hi, I'm Johanna Randall. I work in the Rail Innovation Group with Liam as well, and I also do rail consultancy, and I've read the document, and I also have lots of highlighters, and I'm going to go one better, and I've got post-its too.
Great segue to, just before we start, we released yesterday a report called Parcels of Passengers. I hope you all read it from our website, which railinnovationgroup.com. It's right there on the front page. And that is a position paper looking at the good work already happening with taking small parcels onto passenger trains and then onto cargo bikes at the other end. And that will be the focus of a Munch and Learn session on the 9th of June. So join that. Thanks to everyone who contributed to that. We've also got podcasts, What Moves Us, Johanna and myself talking about what moves us. So bringing us onto our topic today, Great British Railways. Johanna and I have already done a podcast, so hopefully you've heard that. This is more of sort of a facilitated discussion. So if you want to chip in at any point. Otherwise, I'll call on people to help inform it. For those people who have read it, hopefully you can provide some details or some insight as we go. From my point of view, I wanted to just cover off these sort of questions that raise from the document and get the group's input to it. Number one is the key part of the document is
1 o'clock.
It's supposed to be
Don't take the dog anywhere.
So who the person who's speaking over, can they put themselves on mute because we're not all going to take our dog for a walk?
Well, I love these sessions. I find out so much about people. Right, so will it attract more people to rail? Number one. Does this protect the route?
Whoever's in control, mute everybody else and just let them unmute themselves when they speak, and everybody else just mute themselves.
I'm going to just continue on. Right, does this protect the entry route for startups? Does it retain the diversity of approach and creative problem solving? Will it improve the passenger experience and the wider mobility landscape? And does the app / the centralized ticketing help or hinder open data and other systems integrating with the system? So kicking on with that, I think a good place to start is, given what you've read, those people who've read it, will it attract more people to rail? I'm going to call on Johanna to start that discussion, if you mind.
Oh, see, now I wasn't prepared for that question at all. So, so I'm going to do my usual sit on the fence, because I don't know. Because one thing, because I think so much has changed in the last year, and I think it's interesting that Chris Jones is working on a bit of a segue on foreign travel, because what needs to happen is need for travel needs to be created again. And I know the report focuses on a lot on we can't be reliant on commuters anymore. And obviously, you know, people that were involved in data, we saw a spike in leisure travel when we were able to recover last year. But which of those is going to be more important, and how do we make sure that we meet this new demand, if that is the new demand?
Right. So you think the need to travel will return? I did notice that you said in something that you didn't want to, you don't have the need to go anywhere at the minute. So I guess when the things are recovered, I'm hoping other people will chip in if they have an opinion. But,
well, you see, I think that's interesting, because, you know, demand comes from a need.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many people on this call will be going back to the office, but I'm not going back to the office, and I'm making sure I'm not going back to the office by moving 500 miles away from the office.
which is a response to the pandemic.
But I wonder how many people are doing something similar. So I think, the future for me personally will be maybe more longer distance traveling.
Yeah.
Because I will do more business type travel than I will do daily commuting travel. Now I'm interested. I can see lots of hands coming up now about stimulating that. So Chris, do you want to go first? Chris Jones.
Thank you. I'll just come back on that. I agree entirely. A big part of this is confidence. But there are differences between the international and the national side of things, which we're seeing. So the first one is to instill confidence in people with international travel. That's about cost. So basically, if a country moves between a colour list, can they get their money back? So we've done things like implement the passenger charter or work with industry to make it easier. The one with national confidence is more around safety. Do people feel safe to get the tube to work, for instance? Do they feel safe when they actually get to work? Is the infrastructure within offices itself safe enough for people? So it's not just about the journey, but it's also about people going back to work for that. And then in terms of demand, I'm not so sure on national stuff, but the majority of international demand we've seen, this is anecdotal because we've not got any full data on this yet, but it's all what we're calling VFR, so visiting friends and relatives. So it's basically people who haven't been able to see anyone for the last year. They want to go and see them. There's been very little leisure and very little commute traffic internationally at the moment, but I'm not too sure on the national level if anyone else knows.
But sorry, I think I can see that Tom and Graham have their hand up, but this is in thinking in terms of the Great British Railways going in the future rather than sort of the next 6 months. Does that mean that the Great British Rail has to accommodate far more visiting friends and relatives than visiting your work?
So I think there will be an initial wave before we actually start to see what people want to do and how people have changed, because everything opening up nationally it's a new thing to people. So in all honesty, we're not going to be able to see what people are going to change their life like. Really, people are saying they're going to do certain things, but until you actually start to see data and evidence to back that up, I don't really know. But in terms of confidence, I'm not really sure what they could do to build it up long term. But what I have seen anecdotally, separate from what I do, is I know a lot of people who are actually far more comfortable in cars at the moment anyway, just because they are more convenient, but maybe that's down to reduced timetables. For instance, I'm having issues getting back to Liverpool in a couple of weeks because Avanti don't know if they're going to run trains on Sunday yet. They obviously do, but they won't sell tickets till 3 weeks' time, which is too close to when I need to book. But
other mediums are available for you to buy your ticket if you want to take the risk.
Can we hear from an operator?
So what does Tom from one of the operators think?
So I'm going to be open and honest completely. So this is my opinion rather than GWR's opinion. I will add that caveat immediately. But I think it's really important to differentiate need to travel and want to travel, because I think the future is going to be want to travel. And obviously I've come from an operator at SWR where we were massively commuter based and people traveled because they had to. People came into work, people went out home. We got 100,000 people into Waterloo in the morning and 100,000 people out. That was what we existed to do. And obviously we're not doing that now. And actually the likelihood of doing that in the future at that grand scale within the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years is probably quite low. I think the reason post-COVID, actually the Williams review is really exciting, or the bits that I've read are exciting for me, is because it refocuses the industry on looking at what we need to do to attract people back and not having that complacency anymore of, people will come back, it'll be fine. Actually, that's no longer the case. People have cars, people have desks at home. Johanna, as you've said, you're moving hundreds and hundreds of miles away from your office. Actually, why do you need to go into the office? I live in Bournemouth and used to commute up to London 4 hours a day. And actually in a post-COVID world, I don't need to be doing that. And if I'm thinking that and I don't pay for travel, actually somebody who has a season ticket that's £6,000, £7,000, £8,000 a year isn't going to necessarily want to do that either. So I think the reason the Williams review kind of really excites me is about that refocus of the industry into looking at getting people to want to love traveling again, rather than kind of getting back into a position where, oh, we can get complacent and therefore standards.
I think that's a really interesting point to say, you know, that people, you know, want to travel, and we have to, you know, people have to fall in love with it again, because if you know, because picking up on what Jonathan Chatfield's put in the chat bar, saying that the industry had to change before COVID, and so, you know, so that is about falling in love with transport. It wasn't necessarily a pleasant experience before. Did you want to add to that, Jonathan?
Yeah, no, happy to. I mean, I think there's a huge amount in the white paper that I think can be welcomed, and it's a really useful focus, and certainly there's more detail in there than I was expecting as well. There's clearly a lot of gaps still. There's a lot of work to do in terms of developing the detail that goes on it. But yeah, just that point of change was the one I put in the chat, which is, you know, there was clearly a lot of things that needed to change even before COVID. And things that, you know, various of us have been calling for, and just the reality of the last 12, 14 months, you know, looking at footfall, looking at the changing dynamics, the changing markets, you know, well, we certainly need to change in a number of ways now. So I think events like this, where we can just get an opportunity to talk about it, so, you know, well done for arranging it, I think are really important, because, you know, trying to get as wide a variety of input to see where we need to take, you know, what is a good framework maybe, but has got a lot of details still to be worked on. I think it's really important just to get a wide input of opinions on that.
Just, can I, sorry, Liam. Oh.
They're gone, Giles.
Yeah.
No, I thought Giles was going to speak.
Can I just add something? It's Nathan here. So just thinking outside, I think the question was about travelling outside of commuter travelling. There's a couple of dynamics I've seen haven't necessarily been highlighted that will impact, and that is the curtailment of sale of petrol cars by 2030. Now, if you put that dynamic in place and you look at the affordability of electric cars, depending on those dynamics, the travelling at the weekends or non-commuter will turn from a want to a need. So people may not be able to afford electric cars, or they may not be accessible to them. So there's another dynamic, possibly in the next 4 or 5 years, which will emerge, where people will sell their second-hand petrol cars because the depreciation will be so acute, and may not be able to afford electric cars, depending on the pricing policy of electric cars for the producers. So there's this dynamic also coming in that will make people then consider rail travel at weekends to family and friends and leisure as well, which also should be put in the mix too.
So do you, I'll bring the other people interested in a second, but do you think that given that there's these massive changes and very uncertain incentives and reasons for travel, do you think that we had to do this concession model to be able to cope with this amount of change? Could we have done this change with the old structure?
Can I come in here, Liam, possibly? Yeah, a few points. I haven't owned a car since 1976, but I have 20 electric cars I can drive right now. There is a move away from actually owning cars. My daughter has no intention of owning a car. She's learning to drive, and all of her friends hire a nice car at the weekend or whenever they need one, making a phenomenal difference to the amount they spend. Typically, if you get rid of owning a car, you are £3,000 a year better off spending power. Now, people who get rid of cars, we know from 20 years of survey of car clubs that these people make up to 6 times more journeys by train and 2 to 4 times as many journeys by bus, because they have completely changed their orientation to looking at purchase of mobility rather than a car trip or a train trip. And I think we have to look at the transparency of mobility. In Scotland, of course, we have this model. In Wales, we have this model. In Liverpool, we have the model that the Great English Railway has been put forward in the paper. In Scotland, we've got the integration of operation and.
Oh, Dave, you're on mute.
I lost signal.
I just want to sort of like add another dynamic into that comment about car use stuff, because I'm completely supportive of a strategy that doesn't involve cars in the future. But what does that mean for equality? Because that's a very city view.
I'll try. I'm sorry. I've got my mobile tends to give a better picture of the mic, but I see it as something that can extend to the countryside if we use modern technology. And Peter Hicks is probably better equipped for that. I know that with Darwin Pushport, you can tell whether you've got bikes. You could actually do something with Darwin that would know there are bike spaces on the train, there are wheelchair spaces on the train's full or empty. But that is not being exploited enough.
But I guess what I'm saying, because there was someone, because if we go back to the report, there's a lot about, you know, improving connectivity and accessibility and mobility. But if you put that against sort of like the cutbacks of the past 11 years, there's been considerable cutbacks in public transport to some of these rural locations. I mean, like, I think, you know, 3 billion has been lost from bus services or something, you know, in terms of that subsidy. A lot of people that live in rural areas just have no access to transport at all, whether that be buses, trains, you know, or whatever. So there's a big equality issue within that. So you need to think about that, you know, what's the right level of mobility to the right person. Liam, do you want to bring in some other people into the discussion?
Yeah, I've seen some patient people, so I'm going to start with Ben Craze.
Yeah, hi everyone. I just wanted to come back. I mean, I think that was really insightful, the discussions about electric car and affordability and carbon and everything. But if we take it back to the original question, which was, will the move for the Great British Railway attract people back to rail? And following up on Tom from GWR, I think it's not going to be solved overnight. I think it's going to take a while, but I think with regards to a focus on performance, any form of delay is going to be a negative to rail use, and old KPIs such as MTIN and moving towards any form of delay or any form of failure on rolling stock or signalling or anything that's disrupting travel is going to be a negative to having people encouraged to use rail again. So I think if this can go some way to address that will help. Obviously, COVID aside, you know, there's confidence in and around traveling with COVID. I think that's separate, and I think that's hopefully in the short term, or at least within the next 12 to 18 months, that we can run that out and then go back to a more global area of the Great British Railway, which is really going to have to focus on the performance and making sure that we're providing a reliable, dependable service. And the way to do that, hopefully, is through the change of the KPIs that will be enforced onto the contractual changes into the operators. And then I think, coupled with that, simplification with ticketing and not necessarily knowing whether you're on an Avanti train or a West Midlands train, and maybe streamlining that. And then once we've got that kind of solved, we can then start to think about the mobility as a service and how we link in other modes of transport. And I think it's going to be a journey.
It is a journey. There is the app which will solve all of those things, apparently. We'll come on to that in a second, but I do need to bring some other people in. So Juliana?
Yeah, I agree that ticketing is a big part of it, and anything I've seen from articles about this and discussions and every single review up to this point, whether they're called a plan or review or whatever, say that the ticketing system is a mess, it's confusing. Obviously, there's a lot of cost with having to put extra staff to help people at stations because they can't figure out what ticket they need and why it costs so much. But the other question that everyone just asks, you know, Twitter, and they say, does this mean it will get cheaper? Because rail travel in general is quite expensive, even advanced tickets, you know, these sorts of things. There are airfares much more competitive in terms of price. Or renting a car, you know, even not owning a car, that's a increasingly cheaper option. So until the government, you know, it's us being a bunch of nerds who love trains and reading this, and but until the government puts something out that tells the public, yeah, your tickets will get cheaper, and yes, you can book them on an app, I don't think we have anything to like give people. And fair, if the concession model or concession in whatever name they're going to call it, Great British Concessions, I'm not sure. But if that leads to somehow, the operator is no longer paying as big of a premium because it's the concession model, and therefore the ticket price can be taken down, but obviously it's all paying for railway, the cost of the railway. But unless a change in structure leads to a change in price, I just don't think we're competitive at the day's end. Rail has been such a small mode share of travel for so long, and until there's some fundamental shift, and until the government stops, building roads to expand road capacity, right? There's nothing fundamental that we can give people, but we can certainly keep them attracted and make it easy. But the price is always there. And even I try to go to Scotland from London, and I'm like, I don't really want to spend 200 something pounds when I know that a 30-pound flight is cheaper, or I'll even take the coach instead if that means it's something I can afford. But I want to not travel by air for my carbon footprint. So we don't have too much to offer if we don't make it affordable to people.
Thank you for that. I think from my reading of the report, there's no guarantee of cheaper fares, just simpler fares.
Yeah, definitely, and that's every single report. I've been like, what's this about ticket prices? I didn't hear that.
So is this then essentially a report about just rearranging the deck chairs to make as though we're feeling as though we're doing something?
Well,
they all are in a way. I mean, it keeps me in a job. I love figuring this out. I know everyone around here knows we can improve things, we can innovate, we can make it cost less, but until that bottom line gets onto the customer, we're not really making them a customer value proposition.
Right, thank you.
That's an interesting point, that one, yeah.
So I have something moving straight on from that, talking about simplicity for a really easy start. Every week, I work in Manchester, but I live in Essex. So I have to use Greater Anglia, London Underground, and Avanti West Coast to get up to Manchester every week, because I prefer to take the train than drive. As soon as I use different networks, different TOCs, I'm using different apps for my ticketing. I can't have that ticket in app because I have to do the whole journey. I also bring a bike with me so I can get around when I'm in Manchester. That's an additional thing on top that I have to do with Avanti until very recently, after I booked my ticket. Now I can do it online, but that requires extra tickets. Just to give you an idea, I've kept the tickets for my return journey this week. My outgoing journey, I've already thrown in the bin because I've used them and it's confusing. Look at that.
Yeah.
And that's through 3 different websites just to do one journey. And there is 1, 2, 3, 4.
You hold them up again so I can take a picture.
9 tickets there to do one journey. So it's 18 for the return. And I use the railway every week. I work on the railway. I know how it works. So if I'm someone who only does this occasionally for leisure, that'll kill the journey for me. I just won't do it.
I'm wondering why you aren't riding your bike across London. Why are you getting the tube across London?
Well, long story. I'm riding it home from Manchester on June the 24th, of which I post all over LinkedIn, and you can all sponsor me. I will get that in whenever. I will absolutely guilt people into sponsoring me for a good cause. I used to, however, I can't put my bike during peak times on a Greater Anglia train. I can put it on an Avanti train, so I have to have it in a bike bag. So to carry the bike all the way from Essex to Manchester, I have to take the wheels off, put it in a bike bag, have that bike bag with me on the first train and then the tube, because I can't ride a bag across London, unfortunately, and then take it up to Manchester.
Sounds like we need a crowdfunder for Brompton for you.
Well, you make a good point, but on the report does mention the fact that as cycling has become more popular, the trains have been specified with fewer and fewer bike spaces.
There is a piece in the plan about that, isn't there? About wanting more flexibility in it. So however, will they deliver on it?
It's not as simple as that, unfortunately. Speaking as well, me and Graham obviously we're working for CAF at the moment, but the difficulty also for bikes in peak time trains, especially commuter trains in London, is all to do with evacuation times to get people out of trains in a certain amount of time in an emergency. They choose to not allow bikes on trains at peak times unless they're fold up for that reason. And I need to travel in peak time, so I either need a fold up bike or a bike in a bag. There are actually not many bike places on those trains, to be fair anyway. They're 321s at the moment. They're currently getting new Bombardier Aventuras, but it's however I travel in the future, even with these brand new trains that have gone onto my local network, I don't think I will be traveling with my bike purely for that reason. There's either not enough bike spaces or I can't go during peak time.
Right.
So as somebody who works for somebody said about hiring Bromptons, I forgot you could hire them, but it's not very useful if you want to take your own bike on the whole journey. How would you go about getting more bike space on trains if safety is really the concern? Because it never used to be a concern when more bikes were allowed on trains. It used to be about fitting more capacity on the train.
Yeah, exactly. It depends what the train has been designed for. If it's been designed for commuters in and out of London, you won't have a lot of dedicated bike space because that leaves bums on seats. Graham's done a fantastic IMEC presentation last week where he pointed out a row of seats to a train in its lifetime is worth something like £500 million.
It's a lot of money.
The more seats, the better. If you take them out to put bike spaces in, especially on the commuter railway, it doesn't make financial sense for you. So there has got to be reason for the train companies to do that.
Yes. Can I just get in there though? This is the point of, I think one of the points of having Great British Railways is that you're describing a financial case for a bum on a seat, and that is not necessarily a societal benefit, because if that person is driven to the station, that is not a benefit to society. Whereas if they can cycle to the station, that might be better as a whole nation benefit.
And that's where you have to look at things like the size of your carbon footprint and what you consider the environment of that carbon footprint to be. Is it just from the point where you get on the train to when you leave the train? In that case, you only care about diesel and electric traction, or does it count from door to door? In which case you think about your car, you think about your bike, you think about the bus, you think about everything else on top. I think it has to be the full journey.
And that is what I was kind of encouraged to see in this report, is because it does talk about that. It does talk about integration with the bus strategy and the active travel strategy. So it might be the case that some sort of unified Great British Railways can have those thoughts rather than just franchised operators who are with a specific incentive. I'm just going to move on to bring in
Martin's had his hand up for a while, but he's probably forgotten what his point is and wants to make a new point.
Okay, well, Graham, do you want to go? You've got your hand waving even.
Okay. Yes. First of all, to people who haven't read the report, it's 116 pages, which is a little bit scary, but it's big font. The pages are only got about 2/3, so actually it is very readable. So I would encourage people not to be scared of reading it. In terms of the whole issue about cost, I'm one of these lucky guys. I've been able to come to work for the last year. So I travel on the train from Glasgow down to Manchester every week. I live in the complete opposite corner of the country to Lawrence. My ticket price actually to get to Manchester, if I book it a few days in advance, is £35 first class. Now, I think that's pretty reasonable. So the issue about cost is about, do we want to burden general taxation with the cost of the railway, or do we want to travel? Do we want to burden the people who actually travel? I think that's a big issue. I don't necessarily know that it can be raised here, but I get the feeling that Joanna's moving from railway central around London to railway almost non-existent up in Scotland. So would you feel that you're going to have to pay an awful lot more tax to fund commuters in London? And there are many people who are nowhere near a railway who would also have to burden their tax bill with something. So I don't have a view on it, but I think it can be a view taken by people who sit in their own little hilltop. But yeah, it's going to be cheaper. The railways have a cost. Hopefully this group here have a role to play to bring that cost down, but it won't significantly come down. We're talking about handfuls of percentages. It's not going to be cut in half. It's not going to be cut in 2/3. You're not going to be able to get a train to London for 30 quid from Glasgow, unless you book it millions of miles in advance. So I think there are issues of general taxation.
I think that's a really interesting issue to raise, because that's about because that's one about what type of society do we want, isn't it? Because it's not just about rail; it's about all our public services, isn't it? Exactly. And I think it's interesting about bringing in sort of like the perspective of an area of the country that doesn't have, you know, the big public transport, you know, infrastructure that the southeast has, because that's almost like the opposite, isn't it? Because if you live in London, I mean, like, I think, yeah, I don't know what the latest statistics are, but 65% of people don't own a car in London. And I think it's pretty, I'm in Brighton at the moment, so it's quite similar in Brighton. About, you know, outside of London, I think Brighton has the least car usage than anywhere else in the country, because we have an excellent bus service. So, you know, and people are getting back on the buses. People, you know, although traffic is heavier, people are getting back on the buses. So you kind of, so that the opposite question is, as a non-car driver, do I actually want to subsidise roads? It's a similar question, isn't it?
No, absolutely. I think the only couple of points, I think the points that Tom raised earlier I thought were fantastic. I think as somebody who has travelled on the railway over the last year, you know, north and south, we don't have to talk about getting people back. They've come back. You know, they're already come. I now struggle to get a seat, and I used to be able to guarantee a seat on my own at a table, no problem. I can't do that now. If I'm travelling from Preston into Manchester, it's not busy, but it's a hell of a lot busier than it was. So the passengers are coming back. Generally speaking, people obeyed the lockdown rules. You know, we all think that, I know, these youngsters, they've all been travelling. They weren't. You know, as you can see, I've got my orange vest on. I am a key worker. I work in a depot. So people like me need to go to work. So we don't really have a choice. We actually work on building and maintaining trains, so that needs to be done physically. You know, we have spanners and things like that with it, which the guys operate here. So that, yes, I think commuter travel will change, but the point is, this is not about attracting people back. It's about making it the right place to do it. It's making people want to travel, not because they need to travel, but it's attractive. I listened to Williams-Shapps this morning. There was a Transport Select Committee on this review, and he talked about his own local station, and they're outside the Oyster region, but they'd managed to do some sort of deal where it was possible to use your Oyster card or your credit card to get into London. They said it was so much easier that he saw passenger numbers rising just because it was easy. I think, well, the group that's gathered together here are that mechanism. How do we make things easier, cheaper, simpler? And that's how we will generate demand. It's not about how do we attract demand back, it's how do we generate new demand. And I think that's the challenge of this group here.
I think that's a nice little segue, isn't it, Liam, to move into your final question about ticketing,
yes.
and to bring that into the debate.
Just, Zach, if you have a point about the last one or next ones, you're the last person with your hand up, I think. So do chip in. Otherwise, we'll move on to ticketing.
It's obviously a little bit of a paradox, because there are a lot of complaints about what British Rail used to be like, but it's worth remembering that when British Rail existed, we had very large boxes that were televisions that we used to crowd around. So technology moves, services move, so it's kind of quite an unfair comparison. And finally, it feels like the powers that be are coming around to the coming around to the idea that one actually needs to consider this as necessary infrastructure that needs to service the people, that needs to have a societal function, that we can't be looking to have a profit on. Actually, we should be engineering any surplus operating cash flow to make it a better service. It's like the paradox we have with water. Why is there so much lost water and piping? Because the water companies are too busy making a profit to actually service the long-term contract, which is a societal contract, to deliver a service we all need, water. So it's a shame how long it's taken with trains. And then, of course, in the meantime, we have a big chunk of transport, the bus sector, that is still allowed to fight for profits, to cherry pick routes. And again, that just kind of amplifies. In the train sector, we're realizing it needs to be centralized and it needs to work cohesively. But then in another sector in transport, like bus, you still have this massive dysfunction.
Thank you for that. You sort of started breaking out, but there is a separate national bus strategy that's hopefully going to solve some of that. And the metro mayors around the country are trying to take more control of that. So just in the last 10 minutes before we finish, I'm just going to move into the last question I had, which was open data / ticketing / the app. And I'm going to ask Hayden to give us his input on that. I know
there are quite a few mentions in the document of open data, and data in itself is a well-mentioned term across it. What it doesn't really meet the needs, the document, is of an interoperable transport and mobility ecosystem for the whole of this island. What it does, it's very siloed, like talking about the role of rail for rail's sake. And it doesn't talk about the fact that rail should be the backbone of a mobility transport ecosystem, not just one mode of transport. I'm disappointed that there's only mention of the word mobility twice in the entire document.
Right, thank you. I'm not sure if it's my internet or anyone else's, but I also got a lot of feedback. Does anyone have any response to what Hayden just said, if you heard what he said? From my point of view, yes, I agree with that. And yes, you should be able to get particularly people making journeys across networks. If you then go on, as Lawrence is saying, try and get the bus or a bike or a shared mobility vehicle at the other end, you would need another ticket and another app. So hopefully the national app will be the same. Dave, I think you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've just on that last comment there as well from Sutherland. The director of rail at Transport Scotland uses a 1906 railway economics book as a sort of good guidance. You'll never make money just moving passengers around on trains. It's all the peripherals. And the old railway operators used to run the hotels, the warehousing, the distribution, and each contributed in its turn, rather like the Metropolitan Railway was funded and built from the houses that were built around the line. So I think we do have to look holistically, and there are some big potentials for developing and other operations with redeveloping stations. The station mind is one or boardings per year for a two-platform local train station, and the only reason it gets 1.8 million boardings is it's directly connected to the local hospital. So I've been going around looking at the hospitals with car problems, which are literally a 5-minute walk or a bike ride away from a station. And some of those stations are down to about 20,000 or 6,000 passengers or boardings a year. The difference that would make if you made those connections would be phenomenal.
And there is a commitment in the report about that in terms of doing master planning in order to improve accessibility, the commercial value and the connectivity of stations. But I think it is in terms of recognising that there is holistic, and I did see that on the chat as well, that there was a point made very well by Chris Jones that obviously in Japan they have the Suica or the Pasmo card, and I was very lucky to do a study trip to Japan 5 years ago, and I asked them about that and how they did it, and I think this is probably something that needs to be addressed in the report, because I asked them how did they achieve it, and as quite often when I was on this study trip, the operators of Tokyo Metro and JR Eastern, that they kind of look a bit you as incredulous, really, as if to say, why wouldn't you do it? Because they said passengers wanted it. And I think that's really interesting that I was quite positive about the report and the fact that there was lots of stuff in there about passenger, but has the report created the will to do this? Because I've also seen comments about ScotRail having had a carnet for a while, and people saying we've got this new ticketing system coming in on the 21st of June, but I'm not convinced it is actually giving us what we want. So what do you think, Hayden?
Off mute. It's so smart ticketing. One system needs a radical think. It needs a radical think entirely. The answer is often not technology. It's an agreed framework that everybody agrees to. Hopefully, they've got top down now will be some enforcement of this, and top down enforcement of standards and enforcement of the way it is, and then acting as the technical and, to say, operational design authority. So there will be a thing saying, if you do not comply, there'll be a big stick to enforcement and making sure things like ticketing and things are interoperable. Otherwise, we'll be in an even worse mess than we are right now.
Thanks. Peter, did you want to respond?
Yeah, so I think Hayden's just made my point in a tangential way, but I think this is less about having, say, a national app for doing things. It's more about having a national framework and a national system, and then operators and passengers use that system. An example is train planning. Each train operator has their own local systems of train planning, but the infrastructure maintainer, Network Rail, has the central system. Everyone takes data from that.
Do you think the report addresses that or acknowledges that that's the issue?
No, I think it misses a point slightly. Tries to cover a lot, makes some good points, but doesn't drill down, and also doesn't step back enough to say we need a better system overall. Let's look at the foundations of it. I think it's focused on saying what's wrong and having some sort of pointed fingers to ways to make it right. But we need to look at this as a whole system, or a system of systems, rather than just the railway.
Great.
Yeah, no.
Lawrence, you still got your hand up. Do you mean to have your hand up? No.
No.
All right.
Try and work out how to take it down.
So I can take it down for you. Sorry. So I appreciate we've only got 4 minutes left. So if you have something else you'd like to say, then do chip in now. I'm recording this, so I'm going to write some notes later. But if you want to get any points across, feel free to say them now in a very unstructured way if you'd like to.
Well, can I say wildcarding? ScotRail have got a smart card. South West Trains have got a smart card. I've got a bus pass.
Yeah.
I have wildcarded my bus pass to hire bikes, hire cars, and I can also use it for discount on the trains. So it is possible, but I think sometimes it may be guerrilla action where we start to ease things in and eventually force the powers that be to actually change. So I can actually hire bikes and hire cars with my bus pass because I've wildcarded it. And that's simply by associating the card with another account.
So if you're not technically minded, how do you do it?
An ITSO card can be read by all sorts of things. So essentially, if you are going to give people a rail replacement, or as happened at Milton Keynes one time, I was literally only 12 minutes waiting for a coach to Luton, mainly because I knew there was a coach, so I'd get onto it. You could use your ITSO card from the rail to just go up to the coach, put it on the coach. It records that you are actually a train passenger who's using that coach for an emergency replacement. And you can transparently use your cards that way, your smart cards. So it becomes very, very much quicker.
I can see somebody called Linda Paxton, who isn't obviously Linda Paxton, waving. And you're on mute.
Unmute me.
Have I unmuted?
Yes.
Yeah, yes. Has anybody compared the cost of driving a car, with, which is about 10 pence per mile, with any train fares that I've come across in recent times?
Anyone?
I don't know anybody who can drive a car for 10p a mile. That's just wrong.
No, it isn't. It's called petrol at £1.20 a litre and 12 miles per litre.
Yeah, that assumes you've got the car.
Yeah.
Which isn't free.
Yeah. 30 million of us have.
Okay. So, sorry.
The RAC's sorry. The RAC's figures are something like 35 to 40 pence per mile once you considered purchasing the car, MOT, VED, insurance, and all the other costs.
HMRC
and I think the employers usually,
yeah. Oh, most of those costs are fixed, and it doesn't. They don't go up if you drive an extra 100 miles, and they don't drop if you don't drive an extra 100 miles. Big difference.
Okay. Well, thank you. Run. I don't know. I'm going to mute everyone here because it's now making. There we go. We have run out of time, unfortunately, but I know that there's more conversation that people want to have. So feel free to get in touch and also email us if you want, info@railinnovationgroup.com. Thank you very much for your time. It's 1 o'clock, so I'm going to finish on time. And I will see you hopefully in 2 weeks' time for our session on parcels as passengers. But thanks everyone for coming, and thank you for all.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks,
Cheers,
Liam.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.